Hey there, this is Natalie, and as promised, here is the partner video to the one I made telling the Re.Zero Ayamatsu Pride IF story, analysing the story and what interesting details in it there are that can tell us more about the canon Re.Zero route, and can also fuel some nice theories. To understand this video, you'll need to have either read the Ayamatsu IF or watched a full retelling of it. I'll be referencing the stuff I included in my version, but if you've seen Echidna's version, that will also give you most of what's talked about in here, especially if you're anime only, as the bits I included that he didn't due to them being Season 2 spoilers were in the skippable spoiler sections. Speaking of skippable spoiler sections, I'll be keeping all of the spoilery bits in just one part of this video, and will give you a time to skip to before they start. So if you're anime only and avoiding spoilers, you can watch this video safely as long as you skip past that section, which I've tried to include where it makes the most sense, but won't disrupt the flow of things too much if you miss it. So, Ayamatsu then. It is the Pride IF story, with Subaru actually naming himself the Sin Archbishop of Pride at the end, before dying a final death. But I think what is really interesting about it is something that comes up a lot in the canon route too, and that is the interplay between extremes of one of the sins, in this case pride, and its counterpart virtue, humility. We often see with the sin archbishops that they are as obsessed with the virtue related to their sin as with the sin, and in this story this is shown very clearly with Betelgeuse, who, just as he does in the main story, obsesses about diligence, the opposing virtue to his sin of sloth. Subaru even refers to it as his beloved diligence in dialogue. Diligence can be seen as a virtue in people, but when the objective it's applied towards isn't exactly virtuous, in this case killing Emilia as a martyr to revive the Witch of Envy, diligence is worse than sloth. Everyone in history who's achieved evil on any significant scale was diligent. Serial killers and dictators are diligent. The world would have been a better place if they'd been too lazy to enact any of their plans. A virtue then, when taken to extremes and used toward the wrong goal, is no longer a virtue but a factor in atrocities. Subaru here is the same. This is the Pride IF, and yet his whole goal is to make Emilia the ruler, to give her the credit for not only killing people like Betelgeuse, but for killing the biggest threat to the country, by becoming that threat himself and presenting himself to her to destroy. He wanted no credit for anything, interestingly not even from Emilia herself. When his pride causes him to do things and claim they are in Emilia's name in the canon route, and they fight in Arc 3 because of this, Subaru wants Emilia to understand that without him she wouldn't be alive, and that he's been through so much and all for her. He comes to learn from her reaction that as much as he says things are for her, she never asked for any of it, and she doesn't want it. In Ayamatsu, it could be said that this is what he becomes if he never learns that, and never stops doing things for himself and claiming they're for her, but that isn't really the case. In the end, Subaru knows that Emilia will hate all the things he's done. He knew all along that he'd make her cry, but he deemed it all necessary to make her the ruler. This is the extreme corrupted version of humility that is tied to but worse than pride. If Subaru had wanted recognition or admiration for his accomplishments, then he would have done things differently, perhaps becoming a more typical arrogant villain, or even becoming a hero. But in doing all of this for someone else, in the name of someone who would never have endorsed it, he's ended up being something worse than that. Betelgeuse claims that his diligence is motivated by love for Satella, just as Subaru claims in the end that he did all of this because he loves Emilia. But if they'd been simply slothful or prideful in their efforts for those they claimed to love, then it's unlikely that they would have achieved any great evils. Sloth would have done little, and pride would have tried to impress Emilia by achieving things she would be proud of him for, which is what the canon Subaru ends up being more concerned with as he develops. Their belief that they are being good by being diligent or humble corrupts them. As I said in my Re.Zero theory video about why I don't believe Subaru is pride in the canon route, and again in my other theory video about why I do think the Archbishop of Pride could be Al, I think the way the sins are handled as a concept in Re.Zero is quite different to how we've seen it handled in The Seven Deadly Sins or Full Metal Alchemist, where the sin themes are used for the heroes and villains respectively. In Re.Zero, I think it's more about the nature of a balance between each sin and its virtue, of basically knowing that sometimes pride, envy, wrath, greed and so on can be used positively, such as in Subaru's greed for saving everybody, and virtues like diligence, humility, patience and so on can be negative in other circumstances. Emilia possesses few sins and many virtues, but is still a very flawed character who knows she needs to change. I think that most characters demonstrate being off balance in one direction or the other towards particular sins and virtues, and ultimately, Subaru has to gain a proper understanding and mastery of each sin in the main route, which will make him the sage. The if routes show where he fails at this with one sin and virtue pairing, rather than just where he acts on the sin instead of the virtue. The characters in the canon route who tend to already represent a healthy balance between pride and humility are the knights, Reinhard, Julius and Felix. The very concept of a knight being about both pride and honour, and the humility to serve someone. And so I think this is why these are the characters we directly get to see Ayamatsu Subaru's response to and treatment of in this story. I also kind of think of this route as the Breaking Bad route. In Breaking Bad, Walter White's family take the role that Emilia takes here. Walt can say time and again that all of the things he's doing are to make sure his family will be okay after he dies, and he does achieve that in the end, ensuring his money will reach them, even though they don't want it or him anymore. Just as Subaru's actions probably will leave Emilia to win the election, though there won't be much left for her to rule over. But Walt knows, and finally admits to Skylar in the end, that the real reason he did everything he did was because he liked it and he was good at it. I feel like Subaru knowing inside that in the end he'd make Emilia cry is the same kind of admission. Okay, well that's maybe enough English lit style analysis of the themes and whatnot. Let's get more specific and look at some of the details and character interactions in Ayamatsu and see how they relate to the main Re.Zero route where Subaru isn't evil. Rather than go through the whole story analysing each scene, I'm instead going to talk about the characters we see or hear about in Ayamatsu and what we can find out or speculate on about them. The way Ayamatsu's told, using just a few important scenes to give the whole story of an alternate Re.Zero route, means that Tappei has had to be conservative with which characters we get to see, and which things happen off-page, and we have to make our own guesses about. For instance, when Rom and Felt are arrested after fighting Emilia in the loot house, we can guess that Felt still becomes a royal selection candidate by the fact that there are still 5 of them announced. This seems unimportant because Felt doesn't appear in the story again, and I think she's still actually alive at the end as one of the other remaining royal selection candidates Subaru tells Emilia won't be able to top her achievement of killing him. But even with this, there's a small bit of something to think about. If Emilia got her insignia back without Reinhard being there at the loot house to see Felt holding it, how would anyone have identified that a random thief from the slums would be a royal selection candidate? Well, this just cements the likelihood that Felt is the missing princess that people have been searching for since she was a baby. The fact that she has the trademark Lagunica family colouring of blonde hair and red eyes possibly made one of the guards who arrested her suspicious, and then perhaps Reinhard, who had been involved in the search, was called in to take a look and question her, finding she'd basically grown up as an orphan in the slums, which could easily be what became of the princess. Although, interestingly, when we see Reinhard again later in the story, it's not made clear whether he's serving as Felt's knight in this timeline or not. There are other characters we don't see on page but learn the fates of, like the Sin Archbishops of Lust, Gluttony and Wrath, who were all killed by Subaru. Presumably, we are only shown the ones that could be shown without spoiling anything about them that would be relevant in the canon route, so we are given no details about how Subaru fought them. The scene with Regulus doesn't really tell us anything about him that isn't in the main story, so to cut down on spoiler content anime onlys will have to skip in this video, I'm not really going to talk about that scene in specific terms. It feels more like it's there to show Subaru and Elsa working together in a way that makes Ayamatsu Subaru almost feel like a bit of Elsa is rubbing off on him, acting slightly sadistically and not really feeling any shock at it. Though in this route, he never ends up actually empathizing with Elsa's enjoyment of killing. He's just become fine with it as a means to an end, and it doesn't especially bother him anymore to be cruel, at least when he thinks it's deserved, choosing to give Regulus a slow death, even after Elsa's had her fun chopping bits off of him. I don't think there's any particular significance to Regulus appearing in this story, because he doesn't act any differently in this route as a result of the things that are different, and we don't learn anything extra about him. I think Tappei wanted to choose a witch cultist for the scene where Subaru enacts this kind of violence, and Regulus made the most sense, rather than him being particularly significant to the route's story or concept. The other witch cultist we see, however, is Betelgeuse, and it is in the stuff with him that we perhaps get the most chance to see some of the things that relate to the canon story, even though they don't happen in it. I think one very interesting point here is that while Subaru identifies himself as the witch cult Sin Archbishop of Pride at the end, there actually isn't any evidence that he really is, in anything but name. What I mean by this is he doesn't obtain an authority. I did wonder if the fact that an authority of Pride is never mentioned was just because Tappei didn't want to spoil anything about it, and we were to take it that Subaru did in Ayamatsu gain an authority by joining the witch cult and taking the seat of Pride, but we didn't get to see him use it. But according to the Re.Zero wiki, Tappei has actually stated that Ayamatsu Subaru doesn't have any authorities, other than, I guess we can assume, return by death if it is one. I'll be coming back to this in the spoiler section, so keep it in mind if you're going to be sticking around for that. I think then that it's very possible Subaru was actually just a regular cultist, who Betelgeuse and even he himself took to be Pride, but who never met the character I think is involved in dishing out the authorities, and so who never actually was a true Sin Archbishop. It makes a lot of sense this way, given it allowed Tappei to keep any actual witches out of this route. I don't think even with trial and error it could be hand-waved that Ayamatsu Subaru and his small team could defeat certain people heavily involved with the witch cult off-page. And it can also mean that there's someone else in the Re.Zero world who actually possesses the powers of the Sin Archbishop of Pride, but either isn't aware of their connection to the witch cult or isn't acting as part of it anymore. Basically, Ayamatsu Subaru not having an authority means this route doesn't necessarily rule out any theories you might like about who may be Pride in the canon route. You know, like my theory that it's Owl. It would actually be really fitting for Subaru to declare himself the Sin Archbishop of Pride in front of Emilia, when he actually isn't, and has just decided this with no idea what it actually entails to become an archbishop, as it would mirror his most prideful moment in the canon loop, where he declares himself Emilia's knight. The alternative is that Return by Death is the authority of Pride, which would mean that canon Subaru would also have the potential to become the Sin Archbishop of Pride. So if you prefer the theory that Subaru is Pride in the main route, one I don't subscribe to myself, then Ayamatsu also leaves this as a possibility too. Additionally, while he claims to Betelgeuse when he asks him why he's being slothful and not diligently helping him, that he's just doing what his gospel tells him to, we don't see whether Subaru actually does have a gospel, or what he thinks about it. I think it could be taken that even if he did have a gospel, because he doesn't care about anything to do with the witch, he may just have no interest in it. Or it's possible, given this Subaru never worked at the mansion and met Rem and Ram, that Ayamatsu Subaru never learns to read any form of text in this world, and is only pretending he can even read his gospel to begin with. I'll be coming back to Gospels and authorities again in the spoiler section, but for now let's move on from the witch cult to the knights. Subaru's brainwashing of Felix is generally considered to be one of the most unsettling things he does in any of the if routes, despite how many of them see him turning evil in one way or another and killing people. The pragmatism of being willing to use a broken knight who's also a powerful mage makes sense for Ayamatsu Subaru, who, in pursuit of only one goal, behaves a lot more like canon Roswaal, who is also willing to use anybody, no matter how callously, in pursuit of his own goals. At the time of writing this has only just started to be revealed in the anime, with episode 6 of season 2 being the most recent, And in episode 5 we saw Ram say that she's basically okay with being considered this kind of tool, such is her devotion to Roswaal. This is the kind of devotion Ayamatsu Subaru manages to get out of Felix, who, like Ram at this point in the canon story, has forgotten the most important person in his life. Felix remembers someone he refers to as His Highness, and I won't say who that is referring to, as it relates to Felix's backstory in the X novels and isn't a character who's been mentioned in the main Re.Zero story, but Subaru doesn't even need to know who that is. He remembers Krush, and so he knows exactly why Felix's mind is unable to piece together what his own purpose is. Subaru manages to stop Felix from simply killing himself after a lot of attempts, and to brainwash him into thinking that Subaru is aligned with the His Highness Felix has vague memories of, though these memories too would be so entwined with Krush that they make little sense to him. Felix is willing to do anything to achieve the aims of His Highness, including killing anyone Subaru tells him is necessary to that end, even if it's his friend, who he does still remember, Julius. He has also been basically programmed to want Subaru's approval, so he's happy as long as Subaru praises him and gives him head pats, which Subaru simply does to try and keep his fragile mental state in check so he can keep using him. What's interesting in the context of the main story about this is why Felix's brain can't cope with Krush being erased, and he becomes basically a confused, muttering wreck with no idea of his reason to exist. But in the main story, Ram doesn't lose her mind at all when Rem is erased. I think that rather than this meaning that Felix is more devoted to Krush than Ram was to Rem, or that Krush played a bigger part in Felix's life than Rem did in her sister's, making life make no sense with that stuff all attempting to retcon itself in his memory. It actually comes down to Ram having a role in this world that still made sense without her twin, as a maid of Roswaal's mansion, whereas Felix's role as Krush's knight made no sense without Krush. Ram also had someone right there who she was already devoted to aside from Rem, in the form of Roswaal, and so her mind was able to simply attribute the love she had for Rem to him as well. Ram also learns quickly, with the undeniable evidence of a sleeping girl who looks just like her, that her memories have been tampered with, and so can at least logically make sense of things like why she only had one horn when Oni usually have two unless they're twins. But seeing Felix like this, we do get to see for the first time that not every case of someone being erased from the world results in the people who knew that person just going on fine with altered memories. That in some cases, being close to someone removed from memory by the white whale or gluttony can leave too big of a gap for things ever to make sense again, and people can lose their minds, even resorting to suicide. In their appearances in Ayamatsu, both Julius and Reinhard basically act how we would expect them to, and don't really show us anything we don't get from the canon story about them. The big difference is how insane Ayamatsu Subaru views them, and this is stuff I don't think really needs to be dissected, given how this iteration of Subaru regards these characters is stated pretty clearly. However, there is one interesting detail relating to Reinhard from things Tappei has said about this story, and that is that two characters are happier in Ayamatsu than in the canon route, and those are Elsa, which seems legit, and Reinhard. While we don't get a lot of characterization for Reinhard until Act 5, I don't need to really talk about any actual plot points to discuss why this might be the case in terms of his personality, so I won't put this in the spoiler section. But if you're anime only, you'll kind of have to take my word for it that Reinhard does have a personality beyond just being perfect and awesome, because it won't really get delved into until season 3. But I think the reason Reinhard is happier in this route is because Subaru's act of killing his name, as horrified as he is by the atrocity itself, basically sets Reinhard free from the role of hero of the world that he's been carrying since he was a little kid. Reinhard is well aware of his capabilities and has a strong sense of justice. It's not so much that it's a burden on him to do good things, but there is a feeling that the weight of expectations that come with his reputation does sit heavily on him, that he fears that people think he's the solution to every problem, even that nature itself has created him to be a solution to every problem. And that's a lot of pressure. A Reinhard who couldn't stop the country he is charged with protecting from burning, who wasn't the one to stop the biggest villain since the Witch of Envy herself, well, he'd be free to keep on doing his best to do what was right and use his abilities for good without the crushing weight of expectations or the fear of disappointing people by not being able to solve everything. The country in Ayamatsu has already seen in very clear terms the limitations of what Reinhard can do, and with the worst disappointment already over, Reinhard, after the events of Ayamatsu, really has nothing left to fear. The only other thing I really noticed about the Knights is that Al doesn't appear at all, and neither does Priscilla. It makes sense thematically that Reinhard, Julius and Felix, who are friends and who share a concept of knightliness that's a bit different from Al's, might appear, and the final knight, who, like Subaru, doesn't really fit with the others, wouldn't. But I think it's also that having Ayamatsu Subaru in any way get into it with Priscilla's faction would raise a lot of questions that Tappei didn't want to answer here, with Priscilla's faction being the one we know least about, and slated to be the focus of Arc 7. I would take it that Ayamatsu Subaru's approach to dealing with Priscilla is simply to have Emilia outshine her as a candidate, and he doesn't actually meet Al at all in this route. But, you know, if you're like me and you think Al might be Pride in the canon story, then yeah, of course having Subaru meet him in this route would take the thing in a whole other direction. That wasn't what Tappei wanted to do. Otto's appearance in Ayamatsu is interesting because it's really there to kind of lampshade the friendship that never was in this route, rather than to show the Ayamatsu version of Subaru directly causing the problems Ayamatsu Otto has. While we see that without joining Subaru, Otto becomes a debt slave to Russell Fellow and has a far worse life than he does in the canon story, what's also worth considering is that in the canon timeline, Otto was captured by the witch cult and was rescued by Ricardo, who then took him to Subaru. We see Otto meet Subaru in various ways in loops in Arc 3, but in the loop that stuck, this is what happened. In Arc 4 of the web novel, we actually get to learn about the condition Otto was in while being held by the witch cult, and it's pretty desperate. Just as a note, I'm not sure if this bit actually made it into the light novels and will appear in the anime in Season 2 or not when looking at Otto's backstory, but since we know it happens from Arc 3, I don't think this is really a spoiler for anime-onlys either way. But yeah, the situation Otto's in when the witch cult enact their attack in Arc 3 is actually worse than his situation in Ayamatsu, and he'd almost certainly have died. So while on the one hand, what Subaru does and doesn't do in the Ayamatsu route makes Otto's life worse than in the main story, him taking out Petal Juice before he can attempt to take Emilia does in fact spare Otto from ever being captured by the witch cult. There are these butterfly effects everywhere, but unlike with many of the other characters we see, Ayamatsu Subaru isn't directly to blame for Otto having a worse life as a murder cleanup detail guy. Subaru does sacrifice Otto, along with everybody else he has any sort of alliance with in this route, in order to make his endgame happen, so Subaru is responsible for Otto's death in the end. But Ayamatsu Subaru is willing to sacrifice everybody for his goal, again much like canon Roswaal, and does regret having to lose the people who helped him, so it's not a case of him choosing to outright murder Otto as he does with Julius or anything like that. It would be more like the kind of attitude we'd see if Roswaal had to sacrifice Ram, done because in his mind it needed to be, but with no joy taken in it. Speaking of Ram, because Roswaal is involved in this story, we can assume that even though we don't see them, Rem, Ram and Beatrice are in some way impacted by events, though we don't know if Subaru ever met them. It seems unlikely he would have ever met Beatrice, but where Roswaal was the public face of the stuff Subaru was doing in the shadows, it would make sense if he'd met Ram, Roswaal's most trusted servant, and possibly Rem, his most competent maid, where Roswaal may have used them in some of their off-page conspiracies. Ayamatsu Subaru would have had no interest in them, of course, because he's not out to make friends like he was in Canon Arc 2, and they would probably have been expended as tools in some way for the cause by either Roswaal or Subaru. I did see something on the wiki that said that Ram was involved in starting the fire at the end, but I couldn't figure out whether that was based on something Tappei said, and if so, where to get more information about it. I don't speak Japanese, I'm learning, but I'm nowhere close to being able to read stuff, so I don't necessarily see all of the additional stuff Tappei says. So given I can't really profess to know what I'm talking about there about Rem and Ram in Ayamatsu, I'm just throwing that out there as it is, in case you want to follow up on it or think about it some more. Now, it's time to be going into some spoilers before going back to the main bit about Elsa, and then the discussion of the ending. because it makes sense for the non-anime onlys if I talk about some of this stuff relating to Meili before I get to Elsa, and I figure I can also cover the fairly spoilery stuff I want to say about Ayamatsu Roswaal here too, so people avoiding spoilers only have to skip ahead once. So if you don't want any major spoilers for Season 2 or minor spoilers for Arcs 5 and 6, then skip ahead to the Elsa section at the time shown on the screen. Okay, so if you're watching this, you either already know the stuff from beyond the anime or you want spoilers. So I can say I kinda cheated here by calling this section Roswaal, because while he does tie into this, what I really want to talk about first is the witches, or lack thereof, in Ayamatsu. I think that where Subaru is passing off all these witch cult defeats as Emilia's work and raising her reputation that way, Roswaal's gospel in this route doesn't tell him he needs to trap Emilia in Sanctuary and make her pass the trials in order for her to gain support. I think therefore that Arc 4 basically never starts in Ayamatsu. It all takes place in what would be Arc 3, just with the rest of the witch cult Sin Archbishops coming into things earlier because Subaru is actively looking for them. Echidna in her dream citadel never finds out any of this stuff is going on then, and so has no influence on the story. It is possible that the real reason Roswaal is sent to Sanctuary by his gospel in the canon route is different to how he understands it, and it's necessary for the barrier to be broken anyway, regardless of whether Emilia needs the credit for it, given it contributes to the goals of Echidna, who created both the gospel and the barrier. But we can assume Ayamatsu Roswaal would have been instructed to do that sort of stuff at a later time, and Subaru in some way sacrifices Roswaal in a way his gospel couldn't help him avoid before that, meaning the witches and the Sanctuary characters introduced to the situation in Arc 4 are never brought into the mix, and Subaru's actions, meaning the royal selection, is resolved super early and without them. But without any witches, Subaru's witch factors never get activated. He kills all of the other Sin Archbishops, but as I said earlier, Tappei confirms that he doesn't have any authorities in this route. He has Return by Death, which is quite likely to be the authority of Envy according to Echidna, but he doesn't have even the authorities he had already gained in the canon route from Betelgeuse and Regulus, even though we see him kill both of them on page, and can therefore rule out the possibility that there was something different about the way he killed them that meant he didn't get the witch factors, such as having someone else actually do it, as he may have done with the archbishops we don't see him kill on page, and who he hasn't killed in the canon route yet either. Now, while it's easy to see how he didn't meet Echidna and therefore the others in this route, what I really wonder about is Pandora. I'm not saying I think she was ever involved in the Ayamatsu route. She almost certainly wasn't, both to keep complexity down, avoid spoilers, and to keep the focus on the story Tappei wanted to tell in this if about Subaru's mindset, rather than the lore of the Re.Zero world. But with Pandora seeming to be so tightly tied to the witch cult, I don't know, I want her to be there in the background pulling the strings, you know? But anyway, back to Roswaal. So, none of the events in Arc 4 ever start in Ayamatsu, and while there's evidence the events of Arc 2 still happened, which I'll talk about in a minute when we get to Meili, Subaru wasn't there for them. So I'd say it's likely that Ayamatsu Subaru never gets to learn any more about Roswaal than that he's a very willing co-conspirator who's keen to see Emilia win, and that he creeps him out. He would presumably never have learned about Roswaal's gospel, and probably never looked into Roswaal too much either. It is said that by the end he had sacrificed Roswaal, in the same line as saying he'd sacrificed other people he had no particular desire to kill, like Otto and Felix. So it seems more like Roswaal died in the course of his plans, but he never actually planned to kill him specifically, so wouldn't have researched how to beat him in the way he did with the witch cultists, probably never really learning too much about him. Roswaal was basically the only person who seemed to share Subaru's goal 100%, and his actions were making Roswaal happy, unlike in the canon story, so there would have been no conflict between them as long as Roswaal never turned out to have shady intentions towards Emilia, which we know he doesn't. He legitimately does want to make her ruler so he can kill the dragon, and he isn't interested in any women that aren't Echidna anyway. But while Subaru would never have figured out the stuff about Roswaal he learns in Arc 4 in this route, how about whether Roswaal figures out the same stuff about him? By which I mean, does Ayamatsu Roswaal know or suspect anything about Return by Death? I feel like he probably did. In the canon story, it seems to occur to him before Arc 4, which is why he trusted that the fairly trash Subaru who embarrassed himself in court would somehow change overnight into someone capable of all the negotiating, fighting and strategizing he did later in Arc 3. And we can assume his gospel is still in this route, prompting Roswaal to do things that will lead to Subaru getting involved in his plans in the first place, like hiring Elsa for the insignia job. I think it's quite possible then that the way Ayamatsu Roswaal dies is similar to some of the loops in Arc 4, where things go in a different way to what his gospel instructs, and Roswaal gives up on the current life, entrusting that Subaru will reset the world and the version of him in another timeline will get what he wants. This seems to be the only state Roswaal can be in where he can just die without putting up a massive fight, so I think that's probably what happened, and unfortunately for him, Subaru made it to a later save point. Probably the last one in the story where Meili has just died, without dying again. Given he's not easy to kill, and Subaru should have never felt the need to kill him, I definitely think Roswaal was aware of Return by Death, and basically stopped trying at some point in the second to last loop. Now, on to the other character it's hard to talk about without spoilers. Meili is probably the character in Ayamatsu who has the most similar interactions with Subaru to what she has in the canon story. Even though this version of Subaru is not the same, and doesn't try to get along with Meili for the same reasons, they do seem to quite like each other. The banter they have after Subaru kills Betelgeuse manages to pretty much sum up Meili as a character by being both cute and terrifying all at once. But here she drops a line that tells us a bit about how events from Arc 2 play out in the Ayamatsu version. When talking about how she and Subaru are friends, Meili mentions her other friends, saying Petra and the others. Subaru has no idea who she means, assuming they were people she met through work. "So, you do have friends," Subaru says, to which Meili replies, "I do, but I killed them all." We can assume this means that just like in the canon Arc 2, Meili was hired to attack the village using witch beasts. Only in Ayamatsu she was successful in killing all of the village children, including Petra. Oh no, please not Petra. This is kind of surprising, as I would have thought Roswaal would have resolved that situation were Subaru not there, but we still don't really know why Meili has been attacking in the main route, other than that she and Elsa work for Capella, who they refer to as their mother. Roswaal explains at the end of Arc 4 that he hired Elsa, but not Meili. And while Roswaal may not care about saving the villagers, it seems a bit weird that these peasant kids would have been the true targets of Meili's attack, rather than Subaru, Emilia, the maids, or Roswaal himself. Clearly, if it still happens in this route and Roswaal doesn't stop it, neither Subaru nor Roswaal was the target, and it didn't pose a significant threat to Emilia. That whole thing is a mystery. The other thing I want to say about Meili is that it was interesting to see how Elsa reacts to Meili's death, given we see Meili react to Elsa's death in the canon story. It seems like it wasn't a one-sided relationship, and that Elsa did love her little sister too. It's not a big dramatic reaction, but from Elsa it was enough to show that she did care that Meili was killed. I also want a pet guilty lore. Just before I get back to the non-spoiler parts and the possible meanings of the ending of Ayamatsu, I just want to mention a couple of spoilery points about Elsa. Firstly, it was a nice touch how Subaru, watching Elsa slaughtering the guards, compares her to a vampire. It mirrors Garfield comparing her to vampires he's read stories about when she talks about how she isn't entirely human in Arc 4. Secondly, I think it can almost seem like a Deus Ex Machina when Elsa turns out to be alive and ready to fight Reinhard at the end of Ayamatsu, if you don't know about Elsa's Deadpool-like regeneration ability, which we'll see later in Season 2. But it seems like in Ayamatsu, Subaru doesn't know about this talent of Elsa's either. That would mean, in all of the story, she's never been badly injured enough working for Subaru to need to show him that she can do this. It also makes me wonder whether wounded Elsa really needed Subaru's help at all when he first approaches her after her fight with Reinhard, or whether she just went along with it to see where he was going with it. Okay, now back to the anime-only safe stuff, so I won't be mentioning Meili again or Elsa's abilities for the rest of the stuff about her. Elsa, as I said earlier, is a character that Tappei says is much happier in this route than in the canon one. We can see that she develops a kind of loyalty to Subaru simply based on the fact that he lets her do what she likes. And she says to Reinhard when he asks her if she knows who she's defending before the final fight. She even, in her own perverse way, enjoys the fact Subaru seems to want to eventually kill her. At the time of writing this video, Elsa's only just come back into the anime after going practically unmentioned since Arc 1. So if you're anime only, Ayamatsu is probably the most characterization you've actually seen for Elsa, but she's pretty consistent with how she's shown to be in the canon route. It's just that here we get to see her for the first time from the perspective of her clients, rather than targets who are about to die. Elsa is pretty insane, even being excited by the idea of being killed, but she does seem to play by the rules to some extent. There's never the feeling that she might turn on Subaru while she's on his payroll, which is quite interesting. Is that a morality of Elsa's own, or is it more down to there being consequences for her going rogue from someone who scares even her? Even when you know more about Elsa, it's actually hard to say why she does a lot of the things she does, whether it's in Ayamatsu or in the canon route. But I think she's a character who actually doesn't change at all in this timeline. She's just given a different role, and it's one she likes. So, I think I've covered all of the characters I particularly wanted to cover in this analysis, with the only one I haven't really talked about being Emilia. But given Emilia appears in this story more as an idea in Crazy Subaru's head than as herself, and when we do see her at the end, we don't learn anything about her or Puck that adds to or differs from them in Canon Arc 3, I would like to now move on to the ending. The ending of Ayamatsu is one of the most interesting things about it when it comes to speculating about Re.Zero as a whole, given that we see that Subaru has, for sure, died a final death, and will now remain in that dark place he goes to when he dies, with the being that lives there, who at this point I don't really think it's presumptive to say is some part of the Witch of Envy or Satella. This seems to mean there are conditions under which Subaru will stop returning by death, but just what is this situation hinting that they are? I think there are 4 possibilities as to why Subaru gets to die permanently here, after accomplishing his goal of becoming the ultimate villain and letting Emilia get the credit for killing him. The first is that it's more up to Subaru than we think whether he returns. The witch will keep sending him back basically as long as he has unfinished business and things he wants to do, but when he's satisfied that he's done what he set out to do, she'll welcome him into death. This is possible. We've never seen Subaru in a position where he hasn't wanted to go back after all. But in Ayamatsu, well, not only has he done what he set out to do, but he's made it so that there really isn't anything left that he can do in that world. The second is that the witch has given up on Subaru being able to do whatever she gave him return by death to achieve. There may well be limitations to what she can do in terms of how far back she can send him, and with the final save point we see in Ayamatsu being one where really only 2 things can happen. Subaru either gets killed by Reinhard or he basically does his suicide by Emilia thing, and he's got no intention of doing anything other than the latter anyway. Maybe there's just no point sending him back. Whatever ending she was trying to reach by giving Subaru return by death can no longer be achieved, not within the limits of her time resetting powers, so she gives up. The third is that Subaru actually did achieve what she gave him return by death to do. This is, I think, the most interesting option to think about, if not the most likely. If Satella is connected to Emilia in some way, for example in the way I discussed in my theory video about this matter, then what if the whole point of Subaru being given return by death is to either help Emilia achieve a certain thing, such as becoming ruler and getting to have her wish granted by the dragon, or simply to save Emilia from certain threats. Things he achieves in Ayamatsu in a totally different way, but which we can see he might also achieve in the canon story. Originally, she may have expected Subaru, who she loves for whatever reason she does, to do things differently and achieve a good ending for himself. But this Subaru, who failed at overcoming a sin in a way that he does overcome it in the canon arc, still managed to serve his purpose in some ways, and so now he can rest. The fourth is a bit weirder and probably the least likely, but there are some things, I'll keep super vague because they're way beyond the anime, that imply that Subaru is supposed to accumulate all of the sins, in a way that I'll also keep super vague. In Ayamatsu, Subaru has killed the archbishops of greed, gluttony, lust, wrath and sloth. He started out already with his connection to envy, and so at the end, when he identifies himself to Emilia as pride, this completes the set. And Subaru has actually sort of united all of the sins in one person. I'm having to make it sound lame like that to avoid spoilers, but hopefully that makes sense. While it's implied that he's supposed to do this so he can actually then do or achieve something as yet unclear, what if actually the witch just wants to rid the world of these things? So once Subaru has collected them all in himself, his job is done, and she can keep him and the sins safe from the world in death with herself. Yeah, I know that sounds kind of dumb the way I'm describing it here because I'm not really referencing things in the story, so it sounds a bit like I'm positioning the whole grand enterprise as a crappy collect all the things side quest. But I'm just including this option as something to think about because it's quite an interesting option in the context of some later things. That's not to say I think it's right, just that it's worth noting that in this route, Subaru does kind of possess all of the sins in a way we never see anywhere else. And that might have some significance. So, which do I think is the most likely? Well, I think the first or second are equally likely. Either return by death stops when Subaru no longer wants to return, or the witch's abilities are limited when it comes to the save points, because of various stuff about causality that I've mentioned in some theory videos when talking about how things like Gospels and return by death might work. And it's possible to reach a situation where basically no improvement can come from a redo, and this is essentially a bad end for the witch as well as for everyone else. However, the other two options do have their places should other theories about Re.Zero turn out to be true, and so I think it's still useful to consider that the simpler answers that seem the most likely may not be all there is to it. Okay, so that was a super long video, but I hope you found this stuff interesting, and I'd love to know any thoughts you have in the comments. I do read all of them. Please give this video a like if you enjoyed this, and subscribe if you want to see my next Re.Zero if videos and other Re.Zero content when it comes out. I'm quite a new channel, and so I really need the support. I'm probably going to do the lust if next, because as you may or may not know, my main job is that I'm a lewd harem fiction author. And man, that if, which admittedly Tape wrote as a joke, is a terrible, terrible example of harem that I think I can probably find some things to say about. But if you all want a different one first, let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do. Speaking of my books, I don't plug them too much in my videos, but if you do fancy checking them out, there's a link to my author page in the description. They're pretty anime inspired, with a fair few of them being isekai, but they're very much on the steamy side, so, you know, you've been warned. Thanks for watching, and I really hope to see you again very soon.